Okay, so hello guys, welcome back. Now, I've recently talked to you about the stratification of Russian society, the hierarchy, the extreme differences between rich and poor. I've given you a little bit of background about migration to the cities and the industrialization, and also the kind of luxury, beautiful life led by the Romanovs, the royal family. Now, we're kind of going into 1900, and in particular, an event that happens in 1905. So on the backdrop of all of this context that I've explained, we see opposition slowly starting to grow towards this kind of quite ancient traditional system we have in Russia, with a very strict hierarchy and this expectation that you don't really question the norm, you don't really question your superiors, you just get on with it and you deal with it. Okay, so we're starting to see, particularly because of the migration to the cities and the concentration of people starting to, I guess, question whether this is right. So in 1905, we have an event known as Bloody Sunday, which took place in St Petersburg, which is one of the main cities in Russia. Now, this event caused grave consequences for the Tsar and the concept of a Tsarist autocracy. Now, autocracy means this idea of the Tsar having total control and power over Russia. So the event itself is evidence, I guess, of the unhappiness of people. But in itself, the event didn't need to be, a particularly big, significant turning point or big deal for the Tsar. If he had dealt with it in the right way, it could have been quite positive for him. However, the way that it is dealt with is what causes it to be such a dramatic kind of shift in attitudes and such a dramatic turning point in the minds of the Russian people. Okay, I'm firstly going to go through the causes of Bloody Sunday, which was the event in 1905. Now, I've gone through a bit of this before in previous videos, but I'm just going to put it all together again to contextualize this one event. So, due to the migration of people into the cities because of industrialization, an urban working class had developed. So this is a group of people living in cities who are the working class group. Now, these peasants who have recently moved to cities received low wages and were employed in unsafe environments. In addition, they also had to deal with their employers on a regular basis. And these employers were using a kind of form of absolute authority in the factories. And they were quite outright, quite obviously abusing the power that they had. Now, while the peasants, when they had lived on the land, definitely faced this same kind of, low pay, long hours, treated really badly, but they hadn't had very much contact with the landowners. They were quite removed from them, which allowed, I guess, some distance and some isolation, and it wasn't kind of hit in their face so much. Now, when you're in the city and you're being faced with somebody who's treating you really, really badly, taking your pay, punishing you for things that you haven't done, and on top of the fact that you're living in awful conditions, really long hours, etc., you're really hit in the face by it. And that's what was starting to happen. And these urban workers started to go on strike as a result of this unfair treatment from their employer. Now, to go on strike means to stop work, and it's something that's used by trade unions today in the UK, in the United Kingdom, where you might, if you're having a real problem with achieving what you think is fair, you might say to your employer, well, we're going to go on strike, we're going to stop coming into work because we don't think we're being valued enough. Now, in London, we have had tube strikes recently. We've had lots of other strikes, train driver strikes, and often it means that as the employer, you're either forced to kind of stand your ground and think, actually, no, I don't agree with you here. I'm going to stand my ground, and we're going to just have to hope that you give up before I do. Or as an employer, you realize how necessary the services are, and you might give in to some of their demands. So, interestingly, in Russian, the word for strike is stashka, which derived from an old colloquial term that meant to conspire for a criminal act. Now, this shows how Russian society viewed strike action as a criminal act and a catalyst for rebellion. So, however, while the leaders of strikes were often dealt harsh reprisals, treated quite badly, punished as such, often the Tsarist government reviewed the complaints, and employers were often required to actually correct these abuses. So this led to kind of a phenomenon of strikes in the 1900s, the early 1900s, because they seemed to actually work. They had an impact. Now, at the same time as all of this is happening, we have this man, and his name is Father Gapon. Now, he was a Russian Orthodox priest and a very charismatic speaker. So when he speaks, he's very engaging. People like to listen to him, and they start to kind of see his viewpoint. Now, he's really concerned with workers' rights, and he kind of headed up a type of union. Remember, trade unions were banned, so it was not a trade union as such, but it was a type of trade union in St. Petersburg for workers. Now, he called this the Assembly of the Russian Factory and Mill Workers of the City of St. Petersburg. So it's kind of like a loophole. They managed to get around the system a little bit. Now, the real trigger cause of this event that happened in December 1904 happened in a place called the Putilov Iron Works. Now, what happened was 4 workers were fired because of their membership to Father Gapon's assembly, so his trade union. And almost the entire workforce of the Putilov iron workers went on strike when the plant manager refused to rehire the men. So suddenly we have 150,000 workers who worked in 382 factories across St. Petersburg, all on strike in solidarity for these 4 men. Okay, so not just the factory where they worked, but also lots of other factories, because of Father Gapon's influence and his connections and his assembly that he set up. He was able to encourage all these workers from all over St. Petersburg to go on strike. Now, by the 21st of January, this meant that the city had no electricity, no newspapers, and all public areas were declared closed. So this had a huge impact on St. Petersburg. Okay, now in terms of events, so Gapon kind of headed up this movement, and with the workers that followed him, they prepared a petition. So they wrote out their demands, what they wanted. They made it clear the problems they thought workers faced, and they asked for a fair wage and an 8-hour working day. Now, once they had done that, they marched to the Winter Palace. They organised a march to the Winter Palace, and they wanted to hand their petition kind of to the royal family, the Tsar, but, make the point that we've marched here, we've come to give you this. We're not a revolution, we're not a rebellion, we're just your kind of dedicated servants, and we just want you to know that this is what's happening to us. We know that you'll understand, we know that you'll see our point of view. Please just have a look, read it. I'm sure you weren't aware of it. And it was that kind of vibe. They didn't want to cause any rebellion. And actually later on, they are criticized by the Bolsheviks, the communists, because their movement had no real rebellion in it. So they really hoped the Tsar would just see their demands, listen to them, and kind of see the respect that they were coming with and fix the problem. They view him almost as God's representative on earth. They view him as their little father, as such is what they called him. So that's kind of the approach they had with this march. Now, what they do is they march with their family, so lots of young children, women, as well as young men, and perhaps older men as well. And they hold religious icons, they sing hymns, and in the end, we have somewhere between, and this is going to sound really bad that I haven't got an exact figure, but it's between 3,000 and 50,000 people. Now, different accounts say different things. Some of the police give lower figures, some of the organizers give higher figures. So that's all proof actually of how interesting sources are, because we have 2 very different opinions or comments on this based on this perspective. Police would obviously want to diminish the problem, show that it's actually not a very big issue, whereas the organizers themselves would want to advertise how many people agreed with their point of view. So we had this large group of people marching to the Winter Palace, and here's the Winter Palace here behind me. Now, unknown to the marchers, the Tsar was actually not in residence at the palace at the time. He was away in the countryside with his family. So his cousin or his representative actually is the one who is ordering and making decisions about what to do in this circumstance. And 10,000 troops had been ordered to halt the marchers before they reached the palace. Now, however, Despite this, some of these individual policemen did allow certain marchers to go through because it was all a bit confusing, and some people sympathized with the marchers, and some of these marchers were able to pass on. And because there were so many people pressing forward, in some cases, the cavalry made charges with their horses and their sabres, and started to trample people. Now, there was also some instances of shooting at 10 a.m. in one particular instance on a bridge. 40 people were killed or wounded in one collision with some soldiers and their guns. So all of this kind of combined is just a scene of chaos, and nobody really knows what's happening. We have marchers in lots of different locations, all clashing with the police, and it ends up there being, well, some sources claim up to 4,000 people killed. Some more moderate estimates say there was 1,000 people that were killed. Again, we don't have the exact figures. Now, that was the causes and the events, and I guess one of the most important things to think about is the impact that this had. Now, although the king wasn't actually in residence at the Winter Palace, does not mean he was not blamed. It resulted in a surge of bitterness towards the Tsar, and many openly stated, "We no longer have a Tsar." Now, it led to even more strikes outside of St. Petersburg in places like Moscow, even in places like Warsaw in Poland, and in total around 414,000 people participated in work stoppage during January 1905. The Tsar was forced to try and appease the people, so try and kind of make it up to the people by creating a Duma, which was the body that they kind of called their more elected, kind of more democratic government. However, the main impact of the event was to drastically change the public's image of the Tsar. They had previously seen him as the champion of the people, their savior, but this event really changed their image of him, and it meant the lower classes lost their faith in the Tsar and the Tsarist system. Now, arguably, that's one of the reasons why the Russian Revolution was so able to happen, because this lower class of people who had nowhere to look to and nowhere to turn, instead of turning to the Tsar, as they always had done, they started turning towards the Bolsheviks.